Julia Roberts has been more than just a celebrity for many years. She is the eternally beautiful woman with a radiant smile and unparalleled grace, who redefined what it means to be America's sweetheart. She is the living flame of Hollywood. In addition to being the queen of romantic comedies, she is also the lifeblood of a whole generation. She is a radiant presence whose laughs become ingrained in our memories and whose glances carry warmth. However, beneath that golden radiance lie fissures too deep to overlook, where each radiant smile conceals a wound, and each elegant step is born on the broken glass of personal suffering. A woman with sorrows that time will never be able to heal is concealed behind the glitz and glitter. The storm of life still clings to her at the age of 57, a cold, all-consuming pain that threatens to destroy the tranquility she has spent her entire life creating. Let your like serve as a tribute to Julia Roberts if she has ever brought you joy, tears, or a renewed faith in love. A fragile young girl growing up in the shadows of heartbreak, where the warmth of love was ephemeral, and every part of her home echoed with silence. Fear and the kind of sorrow no child should ever carry lurked behind the world's brightest smile, the smile that would one day light up Hollywood and win over millions of hearts. On October 28, 1967, Julia Fiona Roberts was born in Smyrna, Georgia, into a family that initially appeared to be endowed with bravery and artistic talent. However, it was already quivering on brittle ground beneath the surface. Her parents, Walter Grady Roberts and Betty Lou Bredemus, were actors who opened one of the first acting schools to accept both black and white students, defying the prejudices of the segregated South. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King were impressed by their bold stand for equality, and they discreetly paid the hospital bill when Julia was born out of gratitude. However, public bravery was unable to shield the family from internal turmoil. There was a lack of money. The family led a modest life, and Walter and Betty Lou's marriage was under a lot of strain until it completely broke down in 1971, when Julia was only 4 years old. Overnight, the young girl with the big brown eyes lost her hope of a secure and caring home, and a deep wound accompanied the divorce. The kind pillar of her childhood, her father, left. Even though he was still loyal, his absence created a void that nothing could ever fill. The atmosphere in Julia's childhood home changed from delicate to unstable shortly after Betty Lou remarried a man named Michael Moats. A new beginning turned into a more sinister chapter. Comfort was replaced by slammed doors and raised voices. Warmth came in short bursts. Julia, her older brother Eric, and her sister Lisa learned to tread carefully throughout childhood, as if they were walking on glass fragments, never knowing when the next outburst might occur. Later, neighbors would remember that police were reportedly called to the house multiple times. Stability was unfamiliar. Julia had no sense of a permanent home because the family was constantly on the move, uprooted whenever stress or adversity compelled a change. Her tiny voice was also burdened by the strain. She had a stutter as a child, with every word catching in her throat as though she were imprisoned by the fear all around her. The quiet girl who shied away from talking was observed by teachers. She appeared to swell under the burden of unsaid emotions. She only started to regain her voice later, with the aid of speech therapy and then acting itself. This was evidence even at that time of a resilience that was subtly developing beneath the sadness. Nancy, a new half-sibling, was born into the same precarious home in 1976, but the addition only served to highlight how broken and burdened the family had become. The Roberts children were raised in the quiet stress of financial hardship, instability, and the pain of unfulfilled promises rather than in the radiance of Hollywood dreams. The house that should have been Julia's haven frequently felt to her like a stage where uncertainty and fear were more prevalent than laughter. And the delicate young girl who would one day shine brightly was taught how to bear heartache in silence far too early. Instead of being carefree, the little girl became quieter and smaller, as if she were withdrawing inside herself. Her silence, the stutter that hung on her throat like a stone too heavy to lift, and her absences were all noted by her teachers. However, she was unprepared for the most brutal injury of all. Walter, Julia's father, who had provided her with unwavering love and tender protection, passed away from throat cancer in 1977 when Julia was only 10 years old. He had concealed the illness in order to protect his young daughter from the reality, and then he vanished in a flash. It was a terrible and genuinely heartbreaking turn of events for Julia, as though the only safety in her frail world had been permanently destroyed. Unable to find her voice in a world without her anchor, she sank into silence. The small house became colder and more deserted. Every corner served as a reminder of love lost too soon, and every floorboard creak seemed to reverberate with absence. Nevertheless, Walter left behind a gift that was crafted out of love and foresight in his last act of devotion. To ensure his daughter would never be left alone at night, he had taped bedtime stories onto cassette tapes before he passed away. Holding the recorder as if it were her father's hand, Julia would curl into a ball and press play in the dark. As though those brittle reels of tape were lifelines against the silence, she clung to that voice, evidence that love could endure. She admitted years later that she listened to the tapes repeatedly until they were completely worn out, as if wearing them thin would somehow prolong his life. The tapes turned into both her haven and her source of agony, the solace of his company and the indescribable realization that his voice was all she had left. The school provided no safety. Her classmates cruelly made fun of her radiant, wide smile, the very smile that would one day enchant the world, by calling her toothy and sneering. Her deepest wound during those vulnerable years was what millions would later hail as beauty. Nevertheless, Julia found a spark that persisted despite the devastation caused by loss, mockery, and terror. Her trembling voice became stronger through acting, first in the safe havens of her imagination and then on small stages, where the lonely child transformed heartbreak into expression. Instead of permanently silencing her, the tragedies strengthened her fortitude. She possessed a depth of feeling that would eventually make her not only America's sweetheart but also an actress whose performances carried the weight of real wounds, wounds that whispered their truth long after the lights had gone out. These wounds were caused by the pain of childhood ridicule, the grief of losing her father, and the scars of an unstable home. A fragile but unwavering dream emerged from the quiet of her shattered youth, carrying Julia Roberts from the shattered rooms of Georgia to the ruthless streets of New York City. She only brought a small bag, a few $100s, and an unwaveringly hopeful heart when she arrived in 1985, when she was just 17 years old. She got off the bus and entered a bone-chilling winter, where the city seemed to be designed to test the weak and the wind sliced through thin coats. She had to shiver through nights that seemed to go on forever because her apartment was small and drafty, and the heater coughed more often than it worked. The hollow ache of hunger became her constant companion as she learned to eat little and stretch cheap meals into days. Each step was a struggle against the bitter cold as she walked miles through snow-dusted streets in thin shoes, clutched blankets against the freezing air, and shared cramped rooms with strangers. As a reminder that the outside world was just as harsh as the inside, her breath rose in clouds in front of her. She knocked on several doors, but they all seemed to slam. Before dismissing her, casting agents hardly gave her a glance. There was silence at the end of the modeling calls. Like snow underfoot, opportunities vanished. The response was no more than 200 times. Nevertheless, every rejection strengthened her resolve. Julia made the same bold promise to herself in the silence of those icy evenings, as loneliness and hunger pressed in. Try again. Her initial pauses were modest, insignificant footholds on an insurmountable mountain. It gave her a union card, evidence that she had a place, even if it was a tiny one, in the world she yearned for. She landed a Clearasil commercial, a brief smile on a screen. She landed her first TV role in Crime Story in 1987. Even though it was only one episode, she was determined not to let her fever deter her from showing up. She had burns from special effects on set, scars on her skin that reflected the invisible wounds she already carried. She wouldn't let them stop her, though. Resilience became her only asset and discipline her armor. Julia found herself at a decision that no young person should ever have to make: memory or survival. Her stomach was empty, the cupboards were bare, and the city's cold pressed in like a sleeping enemy. Her father's antique watch, whose metal had been worn smooth by the warmth of the hand she once held, was the only treasure she had left that still had a slight scent of safety. It was unthinkable to give it up, but she had no choice due to hunger and desperation. She slid it across the counter of the pawn shop with shaky fingers, her tears obscuring the watch's face as if time were crying alongside her. The last thing that held her to her father was the cost of rent, and in that moment it seemed as though she had lost him again. Each crumpled note felt like a betrayal to Julia, like she had to sell her heart to keep her body alive, while the clerk counted out the bills with indifference. She left with the money in her hand, but she was carrying a wound that ran all the way down to her bone, a hole that no amount of food could heal. She looked for that watch and purchased it back years later, when she was finally crowned by fame and fortune. It was never an ornament and she never wore it as jewelry. As though to convey the message, I survived. And I did not forget. The scar was transformed into a symbol, evidence that she had persevered through starvation, shame, and despair and returned with her father's legacy intact. Then came the movies that would help her break her anonymity. Despite Mystic Pizza's modest size in 1988, critics were drawn to her intense energy because they perceived something in her that could not be denied. She was described as a major beauty with fierce energy, a prophecy of stardom by Roger Ebert himself. The struggle did not, however, end. She played the fragile yet resilient character of Shelby, a young bride battling illness on Steel Magnolias in 1989. She wasn't picked first. Additionally, she was subjected to harsh criticism and constant pressure on set, which severely damaged her confidence. She occasionally broke down in tears due to the pressure of expectations, but she never gave up. Rather, she filled Shelby with every recollection of loss and every scar of rejection, and the outcome was eerily real. A bone-splitting performance. Julia Roberts received her first Oscar nomination and a Golden Globe at the age of just 22. The things that ought to have broken her, the cold, the rejections, the mockery, and the hunger, became the furnace that shaped her. From the icy streets of New York to the flashing lights of Hollywood, Julia carried the evidence that a fragile dream can persevere despite all odds. Her success was not the result of luxury or ease, but rather of perseverance, sacrifice, and a determination to keep the fire burning within her. And in those early years, long before she became America's love interest, Julia Roberts was just a young woman surviving on snow and hunger, while holding on to a beaten dream that would soon make her famous. The role that would alter everything emerged from the furnace of struggle. Hollywood would never be the same after Julia Roberts starred in Pretty Woman in 1990. However, the fairy tale started in the dark. Originally, the script had been a depressing tale with no happy conclusion. Additionally, Julia's future remained uncertain even after Disney softened it into contemporary magic. She had to try out again after the production company failed, as though one meeting could change her fate. Even Richard Gere paused until Julia, in a playful yet subdued act of desperation, slipped him a note that said, "Please say yes." Yes, he did. History began to take root at that very moment. The disparity in Hollywood was evident in her meager salary, which was a small portion of what her co-stars received. She entered the set as a Cinderella, whose glass slipper was pure conviction rather than as a member of the royal family. Nevertheless, the world witnessed something it would never forget when the cameras rolled. Millions of people were disarmed by the same broad smile that was once made fun of in schoolyards. Julia Roberts ceased to be an actress while wearing the crimson gown and laughing uncontrollably in the elevator. She became well known. At the box office, Pretty Woman soared past hundreds of millions, but it changed culture more than money. Her style was imitated by women. Fairy tale love was once again believed in by couples. Even Beverly Hills was turned into a shrine for tourists. She had earned the title of New America's Sweetheart by embodying lightness, grit, and vulnerability. However, Julia learned that life off-screen provided no such assurances, whereas Vivian Ward found her happy ending on screen. Fame was both euphoric and cruel. She got engaged to Dylan McDermott, but the promise of love fell apart in the constant barrage of cameras and news reports. She would later admit that it felt like she belonged to everyone and no one at the same time, when she was celebrated everywhere. It was her first harsh lesson in the price of fame. A private life and a public dream cannot coexist without sacrifice. Fame and love clashed, and Julia repeatedly came home to empty rooms, her face still covered in makeup from the previous day's work, gazing at her reflection as if she were trying to find the girl she once was. She sought out roles that required risk, even if they left her exhausted, because she was determined not to be limited to fairy tales. She acknowledged that the emotional toll persisted after the cameras stopped filming Sleeping with the Enemy, 1991, which threw her into the horror of a woman escaping control. Despite the disagreements among critics, audiences recognized the vulnerability beneath the performance when Dying Young asked her to inhabit a love story rife with loss that same year. Although Steven Spielberg's enchanted set enchanted viewers with Hook, Julia, who played Tinkerbell, felt the pressure of expectation bearing down on her. serving as a reminder that even in fantasy, pressure cannot be avoided. When I Love Trouble paired her with Nick Nolte in 1994, rumors circulated in the industry that they were not creatively compatible, but Julia continued to work quietly and professionally. These were crucible years, not easy climbs. She faltered. In between takes, she sobbed in trailers. However, she got back up. Every project served as a reminder that resiliency was forged in fire, not ease, and every role turned into a battle scar. The second coronation followed. Julia Roberts was the dominant force in romantic comedy by the late 1990s, and she wasn't just the pretty woman character. In 1997's My Best Friend's Wedding, she defied convention by portraying a flawed, desperate, and painfully human character, and viewers loved her candor. Julia's portrayal of a famous actress who falls for an ordinary man in Notting Hill, 1999, blurred the boundaries between art and life, echoing her own desire for simplicity in the midst of chaos. She and Richard Gere were reunited in Runaway Bride, reigniting the on-screen chemistry. These films not only succeeded, but they also etched her smile and spirit further into the collective memory, becoming a part of a generation's language of love. Then the ceiling-shattering moment arrived. Erin Brockovich, a single mother who defied authority, was portrayed by Julia Roberts in 2000. Raw and unadulterated, she was a force to be reckoned with. A woman in Hollywood made $20 million for a single role for the first time in history. It started with a salary that was less than that of her male co-stars. Pretty Woman had evolved into an equity triumph. Julia demonstrated that talent and appeal required respect, standing not only for herself but also for all women in the industry. The movie made more than $250 million. The Academy placed its golden statue in her hands and critics praised her fierceness. "I'm just a girl from Smyrna, Georgia, and here I am," she said, laughing through tears as she stood on stage, overcome. It was vindication, not just victory, the final answer to all the questions that had ever plagued her. She became one of the most bankable celebrities in Hollywood history by 2001, when the total box office receipts from her films hit incredible heights. But numbers were never her true legacy. It was this: that a girl who once walked through snow with holes in her shoes and used her father's watch as collateral could become the most successful person in the world and alter the rules of the game itself. America's sweetheart was no longer Julia Roberts. She was a symbol of tenacity and evidence that even childhood scars could be healed. Her career served as evidence that greatness can arise when a person's strength and fragility coexist in the same soul, and her smile had come to represent healing. Even as the world declared her America's sweetheart, Julia's heart was struggling with its own storms, including broken dreams, brittle engagements, and the harsh reminder that love can fade under the harsh scrutiny of celebrity more quickly than it can blossom. Actor Liam Neeson and Julia Roberts had a brief but intense relationship in the early days of her career, when her star was just starting to shine against the night sky of Hollywood. He was older, steady, life-seasoned, and had a gravitas that seemed to calm the chaos that still lingered from her shattered upbringing. Liam's presence was like an anchor in unfamiliar waters for a young woman who was just learning how to stand in her own light. Their romance had a rare intensity, but it did not last long. Later, friends recalled how he helped Julia develop a more reflective side beneath her joyful smile, and how she softened in his presence. She acknowledged that even though she would later characterize that chapter as brief, it had a lasting impact on her, teaching her that love could be both a storm and a haven. Her early work was infused with that tenderness and the pain of its passing. Critics were astounded by the depth behind her eyes, an emotional resonance that was far beyond the experience she had yet to have when she portrayed Shelby in Steel Magnolias or brought Vivian Ward to life in Pretty Woman. Her emotional core was awakened, and she learned that love, even when it wanes, can etch a deeper understanding of life itself into the heart. Liam Neeson was not her forever partner, but he left behind something significant. Dylan McDermott, on the other hand, became the glittering headline of a fairy tale that fell apart under the unblinking glare of fame, whereas Liam Neeson was a quiet chapter of discovery. Its funeral turned into what should have been a coronation of love. Silently, the ivory-stitched gown hung untouched. In their vases, the cascades of flowers started to wilt. The altar was ready, decked out for promises never to be made. The chapel itself turned into a ghost adorned with joy but devoid of hope. Like vultures, cameras swooped down, The world feasted on her grief while tabloids cried out accusations of treachery and cowardice. Julia was no longer alone in her heartbreak. Millions of people witnessed it, a private wound transformed into a public spectacle. Nevertheless, there was only quiet behind the chaos. The gown was still hanging in its box. The flowers were still filling the air with their fragrance. But the dream they were supposed to adorn had already faded. Alone in a silent room, Julia was no longer the bride the world had dreamed of or America's sweetheart. She was just a young woman with shaking hands gazing into a blank future where her refuge had disappeared before it could ever be constructed. The silence surrounding her seemed heavier than any headline, and the ring that had once stood for eternity now lay cold on a table. Walking away was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I knew it was the only right thing to do, she would later admit with unwavering honesty. The weight of someone who had split herself in two, between the truth her heart could not ignore and the fairy tale the world demanded, was in those words. Eventually, Kiefer would confirm this, describing her decision as brave and acknowledging the courage required to leave something that no longer felt right. There was only the silent, heartbreaking realization that two souls had come to a place where love could no longer endure, neither venom nor open conflict. The cruelest paradox of all was revealed in that realization, that the tale that had been heralded as fate had ended with silence and absence rather than with bells and vows, leaving Julia to collect her broken heart under the world's brightest lights. The postponed wedding could have meant disaster for another. It turned into the furnace that refined Julia's craft. She carried that pain like an unseen burden on screen. Critics saw Laura's shaky vulnerability in sleeping with the enemy as something lived rather than acted. No screenplay could create the aching tenderness that glistened in her eyes and dying young. She had a chamber of truth carved into her by the heartbreak of 1991, and she poured performances out of it that audiences knew were blazingly authentic. As a result, the bells that never rang, the empty altar, and the unworn gown all turned into mere rumors. They went down in legend. The world may recall the quiet of that day, but it was from that silence that Julia's true legacy, not resentment but grace, was born. Resilience, not ruin. The brightest lights had wounded her. However, she refused to let the wound define her. They never said the vows. No veil was ever raised. However, Julia Roberts conveyed something more uncommon than any fairy tale conclusion from that silence. She was strong, and the echo of a woman who once stood at the altar of love, chose the lonely path, and turned her most public heartbreak into a testament the world would never forget, lingered in every smile and every victory that followed. Julia Roberts walked away from the expected vows and into a silence that burned her soul long after the camera stopped shooting. She came out of the storm with wounds too fresh to heal in a day, having stood under the brightest lights in Hollywood and opted for quiet over spectacle. Fame followed her everywhere. She was still a woman looking for stability, though, and yearned for a place where her heart could finally rest away from the red carpets and cameras. She looked for company after experiencing heartbreak, and it appeared briefly as Jason Patric, an actor. Their relationship was not predetermined to become a legend or to be written in the stars. It was a brief attempt at comfort, a hand to grasp as the earth beneath her continued to tremble. Later, friends would characterize it as a peaceful respite in the midst of chaos, comfort rather than forever. However, its very briefness exposed a fact about Julia. Despite her injuries, she was prepared to put her heart at risk once more. Even after the world witnessed the collapse of her most fragile dream, she remained resolute in her belief in love. Then, in 1993, she took a turn that even her closest friends and family found shocking. America's sweetheart, Julia Roberts, secretly entered a tiny Indiana church and exchanged vows with country music artist Lyle Lovett. It was a blur, unpredictable, impetuous, and almost cinematic in its speed. She was dressed simply in white. He had on cowboy boots. For a brief moment it appeared that she had selected a completely different script, one that neither a fan nor a paparazzo could have written. Surprised headlines gasped. It was deemed shocking by tabloids, but to Julia it was a desire for acceptance rather than a show. One more attempt to bind herself to reality. She brought the tender pain of a woman still seeking refuge, not the victory of Hollywood's darling, into that church. It was a short but loving marriage. The union was quietly dissolved less than 2 years later. They both realized that their love was not meant to last, but there was no scandal or rivalry. A friend would later remark, "It was brief, but it was real." And maybe that was all it had to be. The breakup served as yet another lesson in the language of loss for Julia. She was alone with the burden of yet another dream folded away. She had no kids to cling to or a fireplace to hide in. She, however, resisted turning her personal disappointment into a public spectacle. Every brief romance and broken promise revealed a new side of the woman hiding behind the smile. They weren't so much failures as they were reminders that despite her mistakes, her heart was still open and still looking for the place it had always been denied. Thus, by the mid-1990s, Julia Roberts had experienced both glimmering and crashing romances, a marriage that ended as soon as it started, and an engagement that was called off. They were headlines to the world. For Julia, they were parts of a greater spiritual journey. She never yearned for the ring or the ceremony alone. It was a haven, a love that would last even after the cameras stopped rolling. There was still more to find, but it was getting closer to its destination. Silence, patience, and the gentle act of remaining can also be healing. With Homecoming, she made the bold decision that her craft could not be limited to a single medium, rather than taking a detour into television. As if to convey that while the stage may change, the essence of storytelling never changes, critics were astounded by her transformation into this new form. Later, Ticket to Paradise served as a reminder to the world that happiness is not a passing fad, that laughter is a sign of resilience, and that the same woman who had endured heartbreak could still inspire hope for happy endings in millions of people. Additionally, she handled the concerns of a fractured modern age and Leave the World Behind, with a seriousness that only someone who has experienced storms can understand. Looking ahead, 2025's After the Hunt is more than just another film on her resume. It's a pledge that the flame will continue to burn fiercely even though it is now steadier. Every project a rare, sharp, and long-lasting diamond cut. However, this reinvention is not defined solely by artistic ability. By influencing stories through Red films, Julia has broadened her influence beyond performance, demonstrating that she is more than just the voice behind the scenes or the face on a poster. She has been Lancome's glowing muse for over 10 years, but she is more than that. A symbol of grace that grows stronger over time rather than fading. Her forays into the world of fine jewelry feel more like embodiment than endorsement. She wears them as affirmation rather than as jewelry. A woman effortlessly inhabiting her own elegance, she now occupies a unique position at the nexus of fashion, film, and business, not as someone who is reinventing herself to remain current, but rather as someone who has permitted reinvention to signify growth rather than change. Eternal but changing, she demonstrates that in its purest form. Stardom is about quietly and steadily carrying the light until it becomes a part of who you are, rather than chasing it. Rumors about her health date back to 2002, and the public has been speculating about it ever since. No rare illness has ever been confirmed by Julia. Instead, she has used discipline and balance to let her life speak for itself. Her days are paced by simple yet revered rituals. She does Pilates or yoga in the mornings, and occasionally she slips into a pool to enjoy the calming effects of the water. She continues to remember that her body is more than just an image. It is a vessel that she must respect by taking long walks on the cliffs of Malibu and through the fields of Taos. She protects her skin with sunscreen as devotedly as some wear a wedding ring, eats in moderation and never goes to extremes. Her self-care is not a Hollywood stunt or a show for the cameras, but rather the steady rhythm of a woman who has learned to keep her peace after years of turmoil. She fiercely protects her privacy, letting the world see her art but keeping her injuries hidden, to see her smile but not her scars. Her home life is characterized by the same discretion. Although Julia herself hardly ever discusses wealth outside of the context of havens, media outlets estimate her net worth to be between $250 and $300 million. Under the same sun that once illuminated her red carpets, Malibu's children grew tall at her Point Dume compound, which has become the focal point of her family. The Taos Ranch, where she and Daniel Motor exchanged vows, is still a representation of peace and love. Its silent walls protect memories too private for the general public to see. The chapter on San Francisco was short. A memory already gone, Hawaii. No property is a trophy, but each one has a story to tell. They are sanctuaries to Julia, rooms that are full of laughter, breath, and safety rather than grandeur. A large portion of her wealth is invested in trusts, which serve as a framework for care rather than a barrier of secrecy, guaranteeing her family's privacy in a world that would still attempt to take it away. Nevertheless, life has left its mark even in this stable haven. Julia Roberts is 57 years old and still feels the pain of aging. The silence of losing her father at such a young age still haunts her. The cracks of a childhood that taught her to be strong and fragile. She hardly ever mentions the void left by the death of her half-sister, but it permeates the silences between her sentences. Even the family dog, who used to be a constant in her kids' lives, has been buried. Reminders that no amount of wealth can shield a heart from suffering. These silent tragedies don't make the news. They are a part of her, influencing the warmth she gives to her loved ones and the tenderness with which she performs. For Julia Roberts, wealth has never been measured in terms of money or square footage. It thrives in the mornings when she can enjoy coffee on her porch, while barefoot and without the cameras at the gate. It thrives on family dinners where everyone is loved and nobody is famous. It reverberates through hallways she has struggled to keep private and is alive in Hazel, Phineas, and Henry's laughter. She remains a star in the eyes of the world. She believes that she is at last safe, which is what she has always desired. Complete. In the house, she has never closed her hands, even though she protects her walls. Julia has given voice to women fighting for equality, to the earth, and to classrooms. She reminded us that true generosity is when it does not seek praise by giving quietly, often without being noticed, when tragedy struck. She once told the story of Mother Nature, using her celebrity not to promote herself but rather out of respect for the earth's fragility. Her generosity cannot be quantified by headlines or dollar signs but rather by intent. Giving to Julia has always been more about alchemy, the process of transforming her own healing into a salve for others, than it has been about charity. This lesson even included her roots. She discovered distant ancestral ties to the Mitchell line on PBS's Finding Your Roots. She responded to the revelation with grace and humor rather than shock, as if to remind everyone that bloodlines and names are just pieces. Her family, not her ancestry, is what makes her unique. The affection she nurtures every day. She has dedicated decades of her life to this craft. What is her legacy then? As the first woman to earn a $20 million salary, Julia Roberts changed the definition of the romantic comedy and changed the way that Hollywood discussed equity. Her greatest achievement, however, is not quantifiable. It's sentimental. Her legacy endures in a smile that was once derided as a child, but was later accepted as a universal remedy. She demonstrated that suffering can be transformed into light, and that a single soul can be both strong and fragile without conflict. The world was reminded by America's sweetheart that grace is not perfection, but rather resiliency, coupled with tenderness. These days, her life is more defined by her presence than by premieres. She mostly resides in Malibu with Daniel Moder, her partner of over 20 years, and their 3 children, Henry, Phineas, and Hazel, who are now young adults entering the workforce but are still fiercely protected from the prying eyes of the outside world. She still goes back to Taos. She continues to walk the red carpet when a story beckons her. Her compass, however, has changed. She once declared, "My life is mine." Her revolution is contained in that silent proclamation. Once trudging through snow with holes in her shoes, the young girl now traverses her ranch's grass barefoot. Instead of racing against time, the young woman who once used her father's watch as collateral now wears it as a symbol of her perseverance. The actress who once thought she might never find a safe haven has created one that is so resilient that it can withstand any storm, season, or rumor. Her story is about the tenacity we possess via her, not just the movies we recall. She is a living example of how bright middles can emerge from broken beginnings, that even the most beautiful person in the world can make mistakes and still get back up. That recovery is a destiny unto itself, not a byproduct of celebrity. This is Julia Roberts' legacy, a resilient life, a flame that endures through adversity, and a smile that has become a generational language of hope. Julia Roberts made light out of her wounds. Have you ever seen that light? If so, please share your thoughts in the space provided below. Stay tuned for more heartfelt journeys.